There are moments in life when pride dissolves, when carefully constructed walls crumble, and when the things we've spent decades hiding finally demand to be spoken aloud. For Dean Martin, that moment arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in May 1990 when he finally did something he'd sworn he would never do: walk into a dying man's hospital room and reveal the truth he'd been carrying for 30 years. Sammy Davis Jr. was slipping away. The aggressive throat cancer ravaging his body had transformed one of entertainment's most dynamic performers into a shell of his former self. Confined to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, connected to a web of medical equipment, Sammy existed in that twilight space between living and leaving. His voice, once capable of filling massive theaters with song, had been reduced to rasping whispers. The boundless energy that had made him a legend now flickered like a candle in strong wind. Hollywood had been processing this loss in real time. The steady parade of famous faces through Sammy's hospital room read like a who's who of American entertainment. Frank Sinatra had practically moved in, arriving each morning to grip his friend's hand and reminisce about the nights when they owned Las Vegas. Elizabeth Taylor's floral arrangements lined every available surface. Liza Minnelli had performed private concerts at bedside, her voice carrying melodies that had once belonged to Sammy's repertoire. The industry understood it was witnessing the end of an era, but one crucial figure remained conspicuously absent. As weeks accumulated and Sammy's condition deteriorated, the empty chair beside his bed represented more than just a missing visitor. It symbolized a relationship that had never quite reached the depths both men secretly craved. Dean Martin, the cool crooner who'd shared countless stages with Sammy, who'd been there for every triumph and transformation of their legendary partnership, hadn't shown his face. This absence gnawed at Sammy in ways the cancer couldn't touch. Physical pain had medication, but the ache of abandonment by someone you considered family, that wound ran deeper than any scalpel could reach. Every time the door opened, Sammy's eyes would dart toward it, searching for that familiar swagger, that knowing smirk, that particular brand of Dean Martin charisma that could light up any room, and every time it was someone else, another piece of hope withered inside him. Understanding Dean Martin required understanding his relationship with vulnerability. Where Sinatra wore his emotions like expensive cologne, bold, obvious, impossible to ignore, Dean operated behind layers of carefully maintained detachment. He'd constructed an entire persona around being the guy who didn't get rattled, who kept things light, who deflected serious emotion with a joke and a drink. Hospitals terrified him. Funerals were his nightmare. The entire concept of final goodbyes violated his fundamental approach to existence. Altavice Davis, Sammy's wife, had tried reaching out through intermediaries. She'd contacted mutual friends, sent messages through Frank, even considered showing up at Dean's doorstep to beg for just one visit. Frank had delivered the harsh truth as gently as possible. Dean doesn't operate this way. It's nothing personal. He just can't handle watching people die. That's not coldness, it's self-preservation. But knowing the psychological reasons didn't ease Sammy's heartbreak. Their bond stretched back over 3 decades, encompassing thousands of performances, millions of shared laughs, and countless moments when Dean had demonstrated his loyalty through action rather than words. The Rat Pack wasn't just a performing group, it was a brotherhood forged in the unique pressures of Las Vegas stardom during an era when racial barriers still carved deep wounds across American society. Sammy carried precious memories of Dean's quiet heroism. Back when hotels still enforced segregation policies, when even world-famous performers of color faced humiliating restrictions, Dean had been the one who quietly revolutionized their contracts. He never held press conferences or issued statements. He simply ensured that every agreement included ironclad language guaranteeing equal treatment for all members of their ensemble. While others made speeches about civil rights, Dean made it economically impossible for venues to discriminate. Dean's "Got Your Back" had become Frank's shorthand for explaining this aspect of Martin's character. The man might not march in protests or give interviews about racial justice, but when it came to protecting his friends, his actions thundered louder than any proclamation. Sammy had experienced this protection firsthand, had felt its power in ways that formed the bedrock of their friendship. Now, as his final days dwindled, Sammy found himself mentally cataloging these moments. late-night conversations in presidential suites, where exhaustion and alcohol dissolved professional boundaries and allowed real talk to emerge, the elaborate practical jokes they'd engineered against each other, each prank a love letter disguised as mischief, those magical seconds on stage when their eyes would meet mid-performance and some shared joke incomprehensible to the audience would send them both into genuine laughter that enhanced rather than disrupted the show. Yet Dean remained absent, and with each sunrise that brought Sammy closer to his final sunset, the probability of reunion evaporated. May 14th dawned as one of Sammy's most difficult days yet. The morphine created a mental fog that made distinguishing reality from dream increasingly challenging. When consciousness surfaced, it brought waves of pain that modern medicine could only dull, never eliminate. Breathing required conscious effort now, each inhalation a small victory, each exhalation a relief. Altivise maintained her vigil, reading aloud from the mountain of correspondence that arrived daily. Fan letters poured in from every corner of America, from people whose lives Sammy had touched through his artistry and activism. "Listen to this one," she said, her voice carefully cheerful. "A young woman from Ohio writes that watching you perform taught her that limitations only exist in the mind, that talent and determination could overcome any obstacle society placed in your path." Even through the medical haze, Sammy managed to smile. Legacy had always mattered to him. The knowledge that his struggles and triumphs had meaning beyond entertainment, that his life had shifted perspectives and expanded possibilities for others. The knock came just after 2 p.m., soft and tentative. Altivise expected medical staff or perhaps another celebrity paying respects. Instead, Dean Martin materialized in the doorway, looking simultaneously determined and terrified. The years had etched themselves deeply into Dean's features. His son Dean Paul's death in a 1987 plane crash had extracted a terrible toll, transforming the perpetually youthful playboy into something weathered and uncertain. The confident swagger that had defined him was gone, replaced by the careful movements of someone who'd learned that life could shatter without warning. Altivise's gasp of surprise was audible. She'd accepted that this visit would never happen, had made peace with Dean's absence as just another painful aspect of losing Sammy. Yet here he stood, violating his own rules, doing the thing he'd sworn never to do. Dean approached slowly, as if afraid sudden movement might break the spell keeping him there. His gaze took in the medical equipment, the physical deterioration, the undeniable reality of approaching death. For several eternal seconds, neither man spoke. Then Sammy's eyes opened, consciousness returning with unexpected clarity, focusing on the face he desperately hoped to see one more time. "Dino," he whispered, the nickname emerging as barely a breath. "Hey, Smokey," Dean replied, employing his own decades-old nickname for Sammy. "You look absolutely terrible." The joke, so quintessentially Dean Martin, triggered laughter from Sammy despite his condition. The laugh immediately transformed into coughing, but his eyes sparkled with joy for the first time in weeks. Dean had brought himself, which meant he'd brought the possibility of honest conversation. Dean settled into the bedside chair, and for long minutes, they simply existed together. 3 decades of shared history passed between them in comfortable silence. They'd always communicated as much through presence as through words. "I wasn't certain you'd come," Sammy finally managed. Dean's carefully maintained mask cracked slightly. "I wasn't certain either. This isn't my strength, Sam. You've always known that. But you're here now," Sammy said. "That's everything." Then Dean did something unexpected. He reached into his jacket and produced a photograph that immediately brought tears to Sammy's eyes. The image captured the 5 Rat Pack members on stage at Las Vegas's Copa Room in 1960. Young, invincible, arms draped around each other, frozen in a moment of pure joy. "I discovered this while going through old desk drawers," Dean explained, holding it where Sammy could see clearly. "I've been carrying it for weeks, trying to find the courage to make this trip." Sammy stared at the photograph, memory flooding back. That night, during the Ocean's 11 filming, when everything had clicked perfectly, when the show had transcended performance and become something magical, they'd felt invincible then, like they were writing the rules of entertainment as they went. "We were something special, weren't we?" Sammy whispered. "We were everything," Dean said firmly. "The absolute pinnacle. Nothing since has matched it." Altivise, recognizing the sanctity of this moment, quietly exited to give them privacy. Some conversations require witnesses, but this wasn't one of them. Dean leaned forward, his voice dropping to near whisper level. Sam, I need to say things I should have said decades ago, things I was too scared, or too proud, or too stupid to express. Sammy nodded, though even that small gesture seemed to drain him. I've never been eloquent like Frank, Dean began, words coming with difficulty. I couldn't deliver speeches or articulate feelings, but you were more than a friend. You were the soul of everything we created together. Dean's voice began fracturing with emotion, a vulnerability Sammy had encountered perhaps twice in their entire relationship. When we started performing together, I watched how you handled the degradation, the hotels that refused you rooms, the people who said vicious things, the thousand small cruelties of that era. You never became bitter. You never let hatred transform who you were. You showed me what genuine class looked like. Tears flowed freely down Sammy's face now. These words represented validation he'd craved his entire life but never expected to receive. Remember Miami? Dean continued, when they demanded you use the service entrance while we walked through the front. I wanted to physically assault everyone in that hotel, but you just smiled and said, let's demonstrate excellence. Let's be so extraordinary they can't dismiss us. The memory was vivid. Despite the Rat Pack's astronomical fame, despite sold-out shows and critical acclaim, some venues still attempted enforcing discriminatory policies. Sammy had always chosen excellence over confrontation, talent over violence. You were correct, Dean said. You were always correct. And standing beside you on every stage we shared was the greatest honor of my career. Dean paused, wrestling with emotions he'd suppressed for decades. This vulnerability was unprecedented. Sammy was witnessing the real Dean Martin, the man behind the persona. I know I wasn't always supportive when you needed it, Dean admitted. I know I could have spoken up more forcefully, acted more courageously. Sometimes I was a coward, Sam, but I want you to understand that every performance we shared was an honor I never took lightly. Sammy reached out with trembling strength and grasped Dean's hand. You were present when it mattered. Dino, you always protected me. Dean squeezed gently. There's something else I've never told anyone, something you need to hear. Sammy waited, his entire focus on Dean's face. You saved my life once, Dean said quietly. Not literally. You saved who I was as a human being. It was 1963, after the Kennedy situation, when politics complicated everything with Frank. I was ready to quit entirely, to abandon show business. I felt like our group had disintegrated, like the magic had died. Dean paused, memory pulling him back to that turbulent period when the Rat Pack's political connections created tensions and fractures. I called you that night. Do you remember? I was drunk, wallowing in self-pity, declaring I was finished with entertainment. You drove to my house at 3 a.m. and sat with me until dawn. Sammy did remember. Dean had been spiraling, questioning everything about his career and relationships. You told me that the music transcended politics, Dean continued. You said what we created on stage was pure, that nothing could corrupt that. You reminded me that we weren't just performers, we were brothers, and brotherhood was worth fighting for. Dean's voice dropped to barely audible. You saved our friendship that night, Sam. You saved me from giving up on everything that mattered. They sat in silence, both crying freely now, both finally expressing emotions they'd carried for decades. I need to ask you for one final favor, Dean said, his voice gaining strength again. Anything, Dino. When you reach wherever you're going, watch for Dean Paul. He's probably confused up. Sammy smiled through his tears. I'll find him, Dino. I'll take care of him like he was my own. Dean leaned down and kissed Sammy's forehead, an unprecedented gesture of affection in their entire friendship. I love you, Smokey. I should have said it years ago, but I'm saying it now. You were the finest friend anyone could ask for. I love you too, Dino. Thank you for coming. Thank you for everything we shared. Dean remained another hour, trading stories and maintaining physical contact. When he finally stood to leave, both understood this was their final goodbye. Hey, Sam, Dean said from the doorway. Next time I see you, you'd better be prepared to perform. I've got some new material I want to try out. Sammy laughed one last time. I'll be ready, partner. Save me the best songs. 2 days later, on May 16, 1990, Sammy Davis Jr. passed away. Those present said that after Dean's visit, something fundamental had shifted. The fear had vanished, replaced by tranquility. He'd received the blessing he needed from the friend whose opinion mattered above all others. Dean Martin attended the funeral service, one of the rare occasions in his later years when he participated in such events. He didn't deliver a eulogy, but his presence spoke volumes, honoring his friend one final time. Years afterward, when people questioned Dean about that last conversation with Sammy, he would simply respond, "We said what needed saying." The photograph Dean had brought to the hospital, the one capturing the 5 Rat Pack members in their prime, was discovered on Sammy's nightstand after his death. On the back, in Dean's handwriting, were the words, "For Smokey, the best there ever was. Love, Dino." That photograph now resides in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, a testament to friendship that transcended mortality and proved that sometimes the most important words are the ones we almost never speak. Because in the end, what mattered wasn't that Dean had avoided hospitals his entire life, or that he'd built walls around his emotions, or that he'd maintained a persona of cool detachment for decades. What mattered was that when it truly counted, when his friend needed him most, Dean Martin showed up. He said the words, he revealed the truth, and in doing so, he gave Sammy Davis Jr. the greatest gift anyone can give a dying friend, the knowledge that they were loved, that their life had meaning, and that the bond they shared was real and deep and eternal.